The panel that we have promises to be an interesting one, given the nature of the topic itself, censorship and the arts in democracies, how to push back in India and Hungary. At the outset, let me thank Bob Tepler for inviting me to be the moderator for the session, and I was trying hard to think what would be my most eminent qualification for this. And I think the best qualification I can give is that I graduated from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, where most of the people who graduated from there have been implicated as anti-nationals. And I teach at Central European University, which I'm also told is not probably the most favorite place for the nationalists in the country. So by implication, as they say in Hungarian, one jumps from one pond to another. So I'm here probably by default to talk about how you get defined by ideas which seem to rule the times. Obviously, for all of you here, censorship is a familiar topic. We've been debating about it in different forms. I was here in the morning yesterday to hear the wonderful panel on freedom of expression. And I thought it might be a good idea to go back to that panel and start from some of the issues which are raised here. But on the other hand, I'm also interested as a student of literature and theater and cinema to look at the notion of censorship in two different continents, in two very interesting social and political spaces, India in Asia and Hungary in Europe, and also draw some parallels, perhaps, if it comes out so, in terms of the panelists' opinion on some of the issues. One of the points I think that was raised in yesterday's discussion moderated by Sajal was about probably the formal and informal kinds of censorship that exists at the level of expression of ideas. And I think this couldn't be more true, at least in the case of India, with a Hindu right-wing government in power for the last 2 years, and very clear, explicit forms of control of ideas being implemented both within the academia as well as outside the university spaces. We have had a number of incidents in the past months. I'm sure Arshia will also refer to that. But also in terms of a history of the Hindu right-wing government, and I would even say the political right in India trying to control debate around history, as historians like Romila Thapar have pointed out, to probably revisit the past and make it more suitable for their political agenda. We have been having control over cinema, television in terms of censorship. We'll talk about that too, hopefully. And we also had, as some commentators have referred to, as thought control through different forms of media. But perhaps the most pernicious and perhaps the most disturbing trend has been the use of violence, the use of force against reason, debate, and argument. And this has something probably we might hear echoes from this part of the world too, where there has been a systematic attempt to curb dissent, an extremely high level of intolerance at the level of culture, at the level of artistic expression, and also a kind of engineering of protests, and for which I would be interested to hear if the panel would have some thoughts on the role of the media. At least in the context in South Asia and India, it has been pointed out, and I guess rightly so, that the social media has not always been unequivocal in its presentation of facts. Sometimes it has always been, sometimes it exhibits characteristics of a mob, and disagreement and dissent sometimes are also turned into aggressive posturing and maybe mob lynching. It's a pity we don't have Meena Kandaswamy here today to talk about the problems of the Dalits and the untouchables in India, but it would be enough to remember that one of the leading writers from southern India, Perumal Murugan's novel, which was about an untouchable woman, and probably one of the finest feminist writings to come from South Asia, was asked to be withdrawn from the market, and the writer did it simply because he wanted to save his life. And this has probably not happened in the near past in India, and this has also happened with Wendy Doringer's book on the Hindus in India, which was pulped by the publishing company Penguin. So in the last 12 months, just to go back to the Indian examples, I'm quite sure that most of you are probably hearing it from the international media, that artists, filmmakers, writers have been on the streets in India protesting, and obviously there has been a very healthy debate to defend the ideas for which the Constitution was created, and India was probably hailed as one of the most vibrant democracies. Just to get around the topics that we might like to cover, I thought we could look at it in terms of what would formal and informal censorship mean in the context of artists. How would censorship of ideas be something that we can relate to within the context of literature, painting, cinema, and the arts? And maybe the real challenge for artists, I guess, both in India and in Hungary, has been to find voices which can be used to mobilize counter opinions, both in the political and social spheres, defending their right to express and whether or not to offend. It also goes back to some fundamental questions of theories of art, which have also been challenged in these discourses, whether it should be a mirror to social realities. Does the artist have the right to express his or her own ideas without taking cognizance of sensitivities of communities? And especially in India, the sensitivity towards religion has come up in a number of cases, including Deepa Mehta's film about Varanasi, which was also interrupted both in the making and later on in the screening too. So questions regarding sexualities, questions regarding religion and social life have also been important issues in terms of either defending the freedom of expression or asking the question of where do we draw the line. And last but not the least, I thought we could also come to the point about the role of the state or the absence of the state in these discourses, or the ambivalence of the state with regards to how it deals with these. So maybe I'll start with Zsofia.
Sure. Okay. I will prepare a presentation, but I brought a few pictures, and maybe I can show you through that, and I could reflect on what Sanjay said. Can I? Should I? Okay. That were using quite offensive pictures at the time, and interestingly, these were published in cartoons that were owned by Jews, edited by Jews, and they found a market for this type of cartoons. Here we see that, you know, about the assimilation process of the Jews. Jews dressed up in national folk costume. For instance, they make fun of them, how weird they look in this awkward Hungarian costume, or how to portray a Jew. Obviously, we see all the stereotypes, the big nose, the crooked legs, and well, yes, you know that. The Budapest, making fun of the Budapest. So all this slightly offensive, but this is actually a very offensive picture against the Galician, the Orthodox Jews. The cartoon says that not all Jews deserve a bloodbath, but only Orthodox a real bath, because you know that stereotype that Orthodox Jews in their kaftans were smelly and dirty. And this was published in one of the Jewish-owned magazines, which was one of the absolutely liberal magazines in 1882, actually. This is when it was published, Borsa Mianko, and that was perfectly fine at the time. So I will go back a little bit. This is again a cartoon that was published in many of the Jewish magazines as well, also in the anti-Semitic magazines, how the Jews take over the Hungarians' positions in general, in the army, in the aristocracy. And something very offensive, which I never saw in a Jewish magazine, was Jews portrayed as worms. This was late 19th century, actually, 1896. But for instance, this one was published in almost all the magazines. This portrays that the religious Jews and the newly assimilated city people, city Jews or the banker Jews are pretty much exactly the same, so they just changed a little bit of costume. So regarding the history of censorship, I will just sum up a few words that it's wrong, not 1948, it's 1848 was the date when the revolution demanded for full censorship, for full freedom of press, and to abandon fully the censorship. And what's interesting, it was interesting even for me to find out, I'm from Romania, that here in Hungary there was no law under the communism, no media law, no censorship at all, formally. But it was an informal pressure that led to a severe self-censorship. And only in 1981, when the Association of Artists and Writers demanded for a censorship, the law of censorship, that's when they started to think about it. The artists and the writers were demanding because they wanted to know what are the rules. And this is in the time when the communism's pressure and the dictatorship actually loosened up quite well. So the first censor law, or the media law, was enacted in 1986. Now, what I want to talk about, obviously, is the after 2010, when, as you know, lots of things have changed, lots of new institutes were established, and one of the missions of this was to break down the post-communist, that's a code, you will understand later on what kind of code is that, the post-communist networks and financial interests in the media, public service, art and culture, and academia. Financial interest, yeah, only George Soros's name is missing from there. So 2010 brought a lot of changes. As you know, probably the new constitution was enacted in 2012, called New Fundamental Law. The education system completely changed. The national curricula was changed. Obviously less checks and balances, new church law, but for us what's interesting is the new media law, very contested new law, and the new hate speech laws. And in the meantime, what we have to know that there is a severe poverty going on in Hungary and systematic state-level corruption and quite authoritarian governance. Here I bring an example from Freedom House that estimates Hungarian democracy based on different aspects to drop 50% compared to 10 years ago. What I want to focus here, since Sanjay mentioned also the national government or the nationalism in general, that I believe that the whole censorship in Hungary is based on this nativist ethnic nationalism. The reason why I'm using nativist in order for those people that live in a political state to understand, because it's almost incomprehensible for someone who has an American citizenship that ethnic identity and citizenship is a total different thing, and in Hungary it is. A few new institutes that were established in the last few years, the Hungarian Media Authority, the Hungarian Media Council, and interestingly, they control themselves. They have to make sure that about the freedom of press and about the freedom of art that is presented in press, and it's appointed by the Prime Minister, so it's basically one small club. They have absolute full control on information, content, and sources, and not only on public, we're not talking only on public TV channels or public media, but also the commercial one. Here I quote a little bit, since we talked yesterday, Donia was here, how she criticized in her report Hungary, mainly because of how it's nominated, how authoritarian it is, and how Hungary does not fulfill those standards that was promised to strengthen the media pluralism. Actually, on the contrary, is curbing the critical or the differing views in the country. One more example how the censorship is informally stronger and stronger. The Freedom House again downgraded the country, but it's still classified it partially free, because formally it is free, but informally again it's we see that it's not. What are the strategies for this informal censorship? in these liberal democracies, as we know, withdrawing funds and financial support, which is extremely important in Europe, in Hungary. Otherwise, most of these, even cultural institutes, simply don't survive. So withdrawing funds, financial supports, fines, taxes, licensing to pressure critical media in general, and especially to steer state advertising to other outlets, to the friendly one, loyal ones. Firing critical people and replacing them with loyal ones. We could see just in the last few months how many people were fired or how many artists are never invited in talk shows, or they are never showed, their achievements are never presented, never showed. Of course, intimidation and subtle threats and harassment is something that they experience constantly in a very informal way. It's interesting that the way someone was talking about her experiences, that she was fired by a totally stranger, and it's like a Kafka novel. They fired me. She didn't even know who's her boss and who's firing her and who's above her. Who are these they? According to this survey on Merit Extender Media Monitor, 30% of journalists had experienced some sort of censorship. They had to conceal or distort some of their stories. 36 were asked to do that. But the most important probably, and that's my concept here, is that the use of doublespeak. And that's behind the censorship, the concept of the censorship. On one hand, we have this zero tolerance against racism and anti-Semitism, new laws, by the way, and also banning Holocaust denial, banning Holocaust minimization. Even a Facebook comment can be persecuted afterwards, and actually this happened, and then it can face even imprisonment if someone denies the Holocaust or jokes about the Holocaust or uses these symbols that I mentioned here. I hope it can be seen, for instance, the arrow cross or the SS symbols. So basically the doublespeak is how does it manifest? We will see. At the same time, while we have this zero tolerance against anti-Semitism, we have a very funny website called Kuruc.info, which is the openly most anti-Semitic and most popular website. And these are these menus. I try to take a screenshot of today's issue, of today's website, and these are the menus that you can click on: anti-Hungarianism, fake Holocaust, immigrant crime, gypsy crime, and Jewish crime. And also they now, of course, report on American elections, and this is their word, how they use it: after a Negro, US deserves a woman to be the next president. Yeah, it's my clumsy translations. So at the same time, they let this outlet, this website to exist, saying that it's impossible to pursue, it's the Americans' fault because it's registered on an American server. It's a great platform for your big people. We know exactly who are the people that are writing this, but they let to do it. And not because I believe that the government is anti-Semitic, absolutely not. But in order to distinguish themselves from the Jobbik, in general, the quite clearly anti-Semitic party. So in order to let them show what real anti-Semitism is, I believe that they let them work, let them express their quite hateful ideas. At the same time, the public media, as one of the editors said, and this is the basic concept, this is almost taken for granted, that the public media should be loyal to the government, obviously, and fair to the opposition, okay. Most important is that the content should be more national, so the changes, what the concepts, how, if you look at the media law, and that affects a lot the art, what is allowed in art, the content has to be much more Hungarian and national. Public TV channels had to broadcast much more Hungarian content. Here I give you even numbers, more than 50%. Commercial TVs, more than 40%, or even a radio station has to play at least 35% more, 35% of their songs, of their repertoire should be Hungarian songs. At the same time, as I said, there are many new institutions established, and one of them is the Hungarian Academy of Arts, established in 11, which centralizes practically all art institutions. And interestingly, they have 3 conditions I mentioned here too. The membership, you can be a member if you have an exceptional participation in public life, but the second is patriotism. If you're committed to the national sentiments, national ideas. And one of the examples what the head of these academies brought up was George Conrad, who's a writer that writes a lot about Jewish topics, and he said, well, even though he's considered a broad Hungarian, he could never be part of this academy because he's not a true Hungarian. So that's some sort of exclusion type of censorship. We can see the national freedom fight against liberal media, liberal academic institutes. They actually back up these ideas, and these new academic governmental institutes are the University of Public Service and the Veritas Institute, which I mentioned briefly on this tour as well. I want to quote now what was the founding idea, which Eszter Babarczy, the former prime minister and the founding father of this Veritas Institute, said that it's time to step up against the small lefty, this is how he said, minorities' conceptual dictatorship, the left. And Géza Szőcs, a former former minister for culture from Transylvania, he said that we have to get rid of the old left liberal, aka Jewish academic narratives that hijacked our history for 60 years. Just a quote from Eszter Babarczy, who's the father of this, founding father of this Veritas Institute, how he talks about the immigrants. Just for you to get an idea, casual interview with him in one of the Hungarian newspapers. He says that today no one dares to say that immigration is not a cultural or civilizational problem. It's an ethnic problem. Millions of people with different languages and compared to Europeans, different skin colors arrive to Europe. It's very important not only that their culture is different, but their instincts, biological and genetic characteristics are different. Yeah. And this remained without any particular echo. This was okay. Very important, the left liberals at home and elsewhere are indifferent regarding the national causes. They are even the enemies of this, the enemies of the nations. So practically what stands behind the censorship in art and in media is this new nation concept, renewed again nation concept, which has it in itself racist codes wrapped into decent patriotic language. And I believe that the open anti-Semitism is very easy to identify, or racism is very easy to identify, but when we wrap it into this decent type of nationalistic or self-defense type of language, that's much more acceptable, widely spread, and universities, academies accept it quite easily, I must say. These are the slogans for that. Hungary belongs to the Hungarians. I brought an example about Son of Saul. Maybe you heard about the Oscar award-winning movie that won many of the Cannes Festival awards as well. Son of Saul, it's about the Holocaust. And according to not official and non-representative surveys, about 2/3 of Hungarians said that they will not watch this movie because it's not about them. So this separation of true nationals and not true nationals, the excluded ones, the other ones, works quite well. It's again about them. It's again about other people. It's not about the true Hungarians, although obviously it is the actors, not the actors, the characters are Hungarians. So one of the main logos, again, I keep repeating this, but I will stop, that Hungarian identity, Hungarian culture has to be preserved, defended. We can see hundreds of these types of memes, and but especially in the refugee posters, and I will play a little bit what was the reaction on this. Since yesterday we didn't have the joke parties member here, I brought a few examples. This is the anti-refugee poster which the government started to place in different places last year from spring on. People have decided the country has to be defended. The National Consultation on Immigration and Terrorism, this was the official poster. So this is not the joke poster, this is the official poster. The question is from whom? Who is this enemy? Again, the enemy is the left liberals, obviously, but how is it phrased in the 19th century rhetorical codes used previously for Jews, now for all the others? the other others as well, the gays, the Muslims, the all kind of others, refugees, Muslim, Jews, Roma, that are sponsored obviously by George Soros. Someone actually, one of the journalists that is publishing in a governmental newspaper called them biological weapons on the nation. The ruthless people, obviously, so these are old codes, 19th century old codes that we recognize immediately. Ruthless people that spread corrupted Western cosmopolitanism and globalization, anti-Hungarians that undermine national and cultural purity and national cohesion in general. Of course, they are all financed by US and Soros, the foreign agent that inform falsely all the foreign media. Again, this is something quite important. Whenever Hungary gets a criticism, they were informed by these left-wing enemies. They were misinformed by these enemies of the nation, the interior enemies of the nation. The bankers, people with foreign hearts, idegen szívű, that was a classic motif in the 19th century, and in the 1930s it became the language of Nazism. So these anti-refugee posters phrased it quite well. What's the concept of this ethnic nationalism? Again, this is the real one. The anti-refugee poster, people have decided the country has to be defended. And if you come to Hungary, you cannot take the job of Hungarians. This was, again, after the national consultation on immigration and terrorism, which was, again, a sign under this. If you come to Hungary, you need to respect our laws. However, new online platforms for artists and for those people that were fired or marginalized or silenced from the media and mainstream public cultural institutes are established, and one of them is a show where one of these people that was fired, she takes on a taxi or in her car someone from one place to the other, and they talk about how that person was marginalized, how that actor, how that actress, how that writer or painter was marginalized and pushed out from the public space of art. This is the DTK YouTube show. If you want, you can check it. It's in Hungarian, unfortunately. Direct 36, it was established by someone who was a leader, head of one of the main news channel, online news channel, was fired for his criticism on corruption. And he established this website, which is part of the global investigatory journalism group, and that's what they continue to do. So basically the pushback, Sanjay was asking about the pushback, is on one hand, declaring civil disobedience, hooliganism, artistic hooliganism, flash mobs, street performances, ambiguity. I really liked what Peter mentioned on our walk. He's sitting back there, that a woman screaming in the square, that was also kind of a street performance, like this screaming on the street. And the other one was the anti-campaign, the anti-refugee anti-campaign. So anti-campaign by one of the joke parties, the Two-Tailed Dog Party, and also the Transparency, and also the Thick Skin NGO or organization. And these were their posters. They are quite funny. If you are the Prime Minister of Hungary, you need to respect our laws. If you come to Hungary, would you bring a mentally stable Prime Minister? Come to Hungary by all means. We are already working in London. Yeah, I have to laugh as well every time I look at it. Please excuse our empty country. We've gone to England. Come to Hungary. We got jobs in London. Also, the propaganda that the Hungarian reforms and the Hungarian new unorthodox economy works, they made fun of those posters as well. I save a lot of money since all my grandkids live in Birmingham. The Hungarian reforms work. I've survived the Hungarian anti-immigration campaign. Many of these. And also kind of erasing, deteriorating this, actually this was the actual civil disobedience, what they declared after they teared apart or they erased one of these posters, they went to the police and they declared that they did it. Again, another one, if you come to Hungary, you will realize that Syria was not that bad. All over the city, we had this. Just after you come in from the airport, you could see this. The first poster was this. By the way, it was amazing how much money they could raise for this campaign. It was We hate them. Yeah, I can't talk, I'm laughing too. So, yeah, during Christmas time, so just before Christmas, don't forget to hate the refugees when you decorate a Christmas tree and celebrate a Middle Eastern family that was desperately looking for shelter. So, since we have a Christian, a coalition with a Christian Democrat Party, I think this makes sense. And welcome to Hungary, closed on Sundays. This was just a law that they wanted to close down on Sundays certain shops. If you come to Hungary, you will have to wait until someone emigrates so that we always stay the same. We keep our purity. If you are the Prime Minister of Hungary, you can build yourself a stadium from public budget. You know that our Prime Minister is quite obsessed with football stadiums, and he built a few. And this refers to one of these quite big scandals, corruption scandals. If there were no immigrants, we could talk about the Quester broker scandal, and this refers in German to how the Germans actually welcomed the Hungarian refugees at some point in 1956, and my favorite is this: the hate campaign loves you. So the memes and these posters go on. Hi Brussels, we love you, money still, since Brussels is criticizing us. And I brought another example, Another example, which raises the question of ambiguity, loyalty. No one knows who the hell is this woman. She is a famous artist, Tereskova Nagy Kristina, who first started to cause scandals singing about, as she called it, my scented pussy. And this is how she made this is how she entered in the art space. She became quite famous. And then a few years ago, she started to paint pictures of Orbán, of the Prime Minister. But nobody really knew whether she's doing this seriously or not. She never answered the questions. She always gave very ambiguous questions. And I don't know if it was good for her or not good for her, but she got a lot of money for her portraits, mainly because the Prime Minister's wife, Annika Levy, went and bought several of these paintings. So with this, she kind of shifted to the, involuntarily, she shifted to the other side, and she said that she was afraid that she will get a lot of criticism from the right-wing media, but she actually got much more criticism from the left-wing media. So these are all those portraits that she took very seriously. She worked on each of them 12, 14 hours. So the question was whether an artist should accept state funds or not. And she said, yeah, whatever, because I love money and I love to exhibit in big galleries. And she actually had the possibility to exhibit in very big galleries like the Ludwig Museum and the Műcsarnok, which is one of the biggest contemporary art spaces in Hungary, which became quite terrible in the last few years. And as we know, contemporary art became quite controlled. At the same time, she was accused by the contemporary artist community of betrayal, that she betrayed. Her answer was that, yeah, okay, but he is the guarantee of my financial stability. Many people buy these portraits who like, who look at Orbán as God and who look at Orbán as an evil. So everybody was buying these portraits. They were costing about $200 a piece, which is a lot of money in Hungary. So he's the guarantee of my financial stability. And he came, and she gave this kind of statements that he came down to me and took me under his wings. She was she was quite broke before, and now she's rich. At the same time, we have memes circulating around her websites, like this: when McCain was here, Orbán called him a national hero, and in exchange, McCain 2 years later called him a neo-fascist dictator for establishing an ethnic nativist, nationalist, Christian, authoritarian, illiberal democracy. Probably you heard his famous speech about illiberal democracy. The other example, and I think almost the last one, how the folklore is used again, the serious folklore, even the Hungarian Idol, the talent show, is all about folklore. So it's replaced, the contemporary art is replaced by this folklore, which by all means we know that it's a romanticized version of the art of the peasantry. It's called authentic and ancient and the fundamental base for the national representation. However, we know that this was quite distorted, and my colleagues usually get a heart attack when I say them that certain folk tales that we think that it's ancient Hungarian, it's translations from German from the 19th century. So some of these are called folklore, and the whole secular flag, as you see, and the whole secular mythology was invented in the last few decades. So we call it folklore again. However, they get a lot of financial support, and these kind of places that have folklore events, they are supported, and on the other hand, they are so-called alternative clubs or underground clubs are not only marginalized but simply closed down. And one of them was the Shirai Club, which was closed down in 2011. Also, I will show you how people push back again. So selling authentic ancient relics from Transylvania, it gets licensed very easily. So if you want to sell anything from Transylvania, that's quite easy because that's the sacred space of true Hungarian culture. And the pushback is this kind of games, putting a Hello Kitty in the middle of this ceramics. And this was the answer to that. And what circulates a lot in the internet, making fun of the Kalocsai and the Matyó broderie, which is this very Hungarian, I think it's became part of the Hungarian national heritage, this pattern of Kalocsai and Matyó. So, yeah, one of my students wrote her dissertation on these memes and this reinterpretation. Another one, the memes as pushback. This is a real picture, an original footage from how Horthy, the head of the governor of Hungary, in 1940s, when he reoccupied or retook Transylvania, went in a horse, and one of the head of the Christian Democrat Party that forms a coalition with the Fidesz party every year goes to Transylvania in the same way on a horse, and of course, surrounded by people dressed up in this national folk costume, and even he is dressed often in this, we call it bocskai, this Hungarian type of folkish costume. And these are the memes, the reaction of, with Hitler, with Putin, with bears, on top of the prime minister. This resonates with a poem, an early 20th century poem, where dictatorships are called big-headed big lords. So there are thousands and thousands of memes about him, the big Hungarian conquest here with a foreign minister, with a minister of foreign affairs together, as Niels Holgersson, one of our favorite cartoons. Old Spice, he's the real man, and the real man does these kind of things. Yeah, I finished. The last one is about the monument that we saw, the reaction to this falsification of history. You know this monument, probably everybody, the German occupation memorial, that artists create a living memorial in front of it, bringing all kind of personal objects, and also these banners saying that instead of double speak, we should have a dialogue, organizing performances, and especially the very spontaneously brought together objects form a living monument as a piece of art. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Zsofia, for the whirlwind tour of resistance and caricature and humor that's happening in the Hungarian public sphere with art. Maybe, Arshia, if you can touch upon similar issues in India, primarily in terms of how the state is in confrontation with the artist or the other way around, and maybe talk about modes of resistance which are being tried out.
Zsofia is a hard act to follow, and I'm going to try and keep your pointers in mind for how you introduce the panel, but also respond to some of the things that Zsofia brought up in her presentation. I have to say I was watching it with this mixture of amusement and horror, because when you talk about the laws and the new constitution in 2010 and 2012, I'm seeing a template for the way that India is going in terms of what we can say and how we can say it. But I have to also say this, that, I got to say, it makes me feel a little better that India is not the only country like this. Misery loves company, so it's great that we're all suffering under neoliberal fascist dictators, because, you just don't feel quite so personally oppressed when you realize that it's in many countries in the world. I will say one thing that I think is critical to what's happening in India now, and it's only at this moment, I imagine it will change fairly quickly, but at this moment what we are facing is not state censorship. The state is not shutting us down. It is culture vigilantes. It is the goons, the thugs, the hooligans of the ruling party, right, that do not allow people to say things, that ask for books to be banned, that persecute writers. The way the state colludes is by not shutting them down. There is no, they're not arrested. If they are, they're given sort of a slap on the wrist and sent back out onto the streets. Their sense of entitlement in terms of defining public spaces, public discourse, hate speech continues unabated. And that is really quite scary, because we cannot say that we live in a state of censorship, because the state is not who is censoring us. What the state is doing is promoting a discourse about the new nation, which is very clearly a Hindu nation. And a Hindu nation has two very, very important implications. One is, of course, that minorities are not welcome. And those of us who are minorities and live in the Hindu state better behave in a particular way. But the other thing that is very important, that I think perhaps people outside India are not fully aware of, that if you say Hindu nation, it sounds majoritarian. 84% of India's population is Hindu, so why should it not be a Hindu nation? But folded into the idea of a Hindu nation is the idea of caste. So it's not simply religious minorities who are under threat and in danger, but it is low caste. This is what we never talk about outside the country. Within India, it is extremely clear that Dalits, marginalized people, Muslims in particular, but other religious minorities as well, are increasingly under threat. Now, there are social dimensions to this. It's horrifying. Every day in the news, some young couple will have been murdered because somebody went out with a Muslim, or somebody went out with a person of the wrong caste. Purity is becoming very important. Purity and pollution are becoming sort of social operatives, and the horror of the idea of racial purity or religious purity. We've lived through the 20th century. We know what these words mean. I did want to also say, because the state is not officially doing all of these things, there's a kind of soft persuasion. There are very, very aggressive things that the state is doing in terms of rewriting textbooks, history textbooks, for children. So it's quite likely that in 20 years, 30 years, we'll have a generation that grew up with no knowledge at all of India's diverse, secular, liberal past. So that's what the state actually controls and is acting on. But what the spillover of that is that if you watch television, and I rarely do, and whatever. 6 months ago, I was watching television with a friend, primetime television between 8 and 10. There are only Hindu serials, There are also serials that are based in myth and in history, so Mahabharata this and Ramayana that, and equally there are the great Hindu kings of the past. So the other thing that is happening along with this sort of the Hinduization of the nation is that myth has become history. There is no distinction anymore between mythology and history. And of course, it is Hindu mythology that dominates, and so therefore it's a Hindu history that is being reconstructed, you know, for the last 5,000 years, of course. The enemies of the state are exactly the same: the left, the liberal, the Western, the cosmopolitan, the secular. You know, it's really, I'm so flabbergasted at what is happening in India that it's almost impossible to articulate what's happening and how I feel about it. I think how I feel about it is quite clear. I'm going to still try and articulate it. I wanted to also mention the kind of censorship that we face from culture vigilantes who are basically thugs. There's two things that's going on there. One is the example that Sanjay mentioned, the Tamil writer Perumal Murugan, who actually was at the residency that I ran in India a week before his work and his person were attacked. And he said a very interesting thing. He said, I am dead as a writer. Perumal Murugan is dead. I will never write again. So it's quite different from, you know, his books being pulped or whatever it is. He just said, I will not write again because I value my personal safety and the safety of my family. What happened with Wendy Doniger, which was just a year earlier, was that her publisher, the mighty Penguin, chose to pulp her books because they were attacked, Penguin and Wendy were attacked by an NGO. There are many kinds of NGOs. Not all NGOs are left secular and liberal. There are right-wing NGOs too. They attacked the book saying that, you know, it's anti-Hindu, she's offended our sentiments. And the conversation yesterday in the morning gave me a very important way to think about the world. Somebody said there is no right to offend other people, but there is also no duty to be offended. And I think in Wendy's case, those two things are playing out in parallel. But these kinds of NGOs and these kinds of ideologies are very, very seriously supported by the Indian diaspora, the Hindu diaspora, particularly in the US. There's a man called Rajiv Malhotra who has sort of declared war on non-Hindus writing about Hinduism in India because we are all wrong, we cannot possibly correct, it is a Hindu birthright. The state of California has just had a most peculiar petition placed before it. The state of California teaches in its high schools, in its public schools, about South Asia, and local South Asians, i.e. Indians, Hindus, said that they don't like to be called South Asians, their identity is being taken away from them, they want to be called Hindus. At the same time, they wanted the state of California to erase all references to caste, because if you teach about caste, then our little Hindu children are mocked by their friends that they come from a barbaric country. So a lot of Hindu nation business is very, very seriously supported and funded by a diaspora, and this diaspora is now feels doubly empowered by the government that's in power, by the Prime Minister in particular. What can I say? I have to stop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Arshia, for the forthright rendition of what is happening in India. And it's indeed true that in many ways, not only that the state doesn't play an active role, but prefers to meddle it in a soft way. I was just going to the United Nations report on freedom of expression from 2013, where there's an interesting comment about the changing paradigm of the censorship of the arts, where the old paradigm is considered to be a confrontation between the artist and the authoritarian state. And this is 2013, a contemporary paradigm, and I quote, a heterogeneous assemblage of agencies, individuals, confessional groups, spontaneous groups, that came into existence in response to provocation justified on the grounds of threat to public order and morality, which sounds almost literally the way, as Arshia was referring to, some vigilante groups decide and take it upon themselves that certain novels are blasphemous or they possibly cross the limits of decency, morality, whatnot, and then they shouldn't be read. Some paintings shouldn't be shown. So Maqbul Fida Hussein's paintings depicting the goddess Saraswati nude was torn apart in Ahmedabad. And obviously some writers are considered to be anti-national, some artists are supposed to be less aesthetic. So the grounds of artistic appreciation are not set in the academia on the grounds of aesthetics, but obviously these are groups which have taken upon themselves the duty to define what is art and what is culture.
Sorry, I should address pushback because, you know, I still live in India. Obviously, I don't find my person threatened quite as much as perhaps I should. I will also say that I have a Muslim name. My family is Muslim. I don't practice, but I work on a Hindu text, and I work on a Hindu text that is a religious text. Another gentleman who works on the same text in Kerala, they threatened, and he used to write a column about Ramayana every week, and he got a threat that his hands would be cut off if he didn't stop writing. Now, that hasn't happened to me, so my husband always says that, oh, well, obviously you're not radical enough, you know, you're too much of a coward. But the pushback really is, and this is true of many of us in India, that we just have to we have to do our work. We have to continue to do our work, not because we're very brave or anything like that, it's just that we don't know what is offensive. Yeah? Being offended now in India is so random that it doesn't matter. You just, you know, suddenly you've offended somebody. So you cannot censor yourself, you cannot be careful, you cannot prevent what you're saying because you don't know what it is that's wrong. So in a sense, it's a very liberating position to be in. You know, I'm free to say whatever I want until somebody comes to cut my hands off. We'll see. So.
Thank you, Arshia. Eszter, would you like to step in here to maybe speak a bit more about what are the challenges that artists face in Hungary and what would be some of the modes of resistance that you would like to share?
Thank you. And I am really sorry I wasn't able to participate in earlier sessions, but I am glad that we have some mementos of those lectures, and I'm very glad that this is being broadcast also. And there's very little I could add to the little horrors of Hungary kind of picture that Zsofia painted about our country, so I would be a bit contrarian, as is my usual stance. And I would say that Hungary is far, far, far from India in terms of danger or vigilantism. There is no vigilantism really in Hungary that would threaten anyone who expresses himself or herself. Even, I would say that very few gay couples or especially religious minorities are threatened. So I would say that Hungary is overall mentally poisonous but physically safe country. That's a huge difference from India, as I understand it. So the second thing that I have to add is that I would have come up with the same example of pushback as Zsofia did, that is the two-tailed dog party. That's a very unfortunate situation, I must say, or indicator of Hungary, because there is probably only one example of an effective pushback. And there is, and that's the campaign by the two-tailed dog party that was funded through Facebook by individuals in the public. It was a Facebook campaign. Now, why? I tend to think that we inherited and built up cultural institutions that the Soros network or George Soros is very much part of this network of institutions that I would call a system of parallel institutions. Whoever was in power, whether left liberals were in power, they would support their own institutions, right? And vice versa. Now, this government is not very interested in culture. That's probably our luck. And also that our country was thoroughly colonized by American and European popular media and culture. Therefore, they don't care, really. But it also means that it's extremely hard to reach them beyond those institutions that, in a way, recirculate the same audiences, the same people. So it's a very closed world for liberal cosmopolitan art world. It's a rather closed place, which is being deprived of funding. That's the way the government suffocates these voices, not with direct censorship. While there is a huge and really disgustingly corrupt right-wing media and cultural sphere that produces nothing for millions of dollars in public subsidies. But to come back to the problem of parallel institutions, those people who were socialized in these parallel institutions are less ready to go out, to reach out to those audiences that could be mobilized by the two-tailed dog campaign. That is to say, there is another form of pushback was an initiative to launch an off-biennale art festival because the art world is more or less taken over by Fidesz-friendly guys, although this is not completely true either. And it couldn't really find private sponsors. It was not a very popular event, which means that the embeddedness of this kind of cultural language, this cosmopolitan European or even Euro-Atlantic or global cultural language of the elites is completely incomprehensible to Hungarian audiences. And this is where I find a very urgent need for us to learn to speak a different language and to get close and mobilize people. If we fail to do that, we will simply be we'll shrivel, so to say, through lack of funds and lack of interest, without being obviously oppressed, especially threatened in body and limb. So that's about it, what I wanted to add to Zsofia's picture.
Thank you, Eszter. I think there is a lot of food for thought and discussion there, but I just want to come back to one question which I think is uppermost in all our minds when we speak about art and censorship. And going back to Plato, who banished the poet from his ideal republic, I think the artist has always had a very strange position in the social space, either because he always spoke the truth, and that has, I think, interestingly enough in Hungary and in the post-communist world, also be the question that you also, I guess, keep listening about how many artists were informers during the regime, and also about the kind of collaborations which maybe filmmakers or writers had with the state. And we have come across this point again now in all the three presentations about funding, the role of the state, and patronage, which I think continue to be important issues even in India. As Arshia pointed out, the state probably doesn't consider art to be the most important thing at the moment. They're far busy with the economy. But on the other hand, you also find that through the institutions like the State Academy of Letters or other places, which in India as a post-colonial legacy, we have cultural institutions which are supposed to set benchmarks of critical taste. And we have seen that in the last year, especially when a rationalist thinker was shot dead in broad daylight, number of writers returned their awards, resigned from panels, And this did create an outrage and debate about how much can the writer remain detached from social realities? Is it the duty of a writer to participate in politics? And the whole question, which goes back to, I think, even issues in state socialism, the relationship between the state and the artist. And I think that's an interesting question to ask today, 25 years after the fall of communism in Hungary. Where does the writer find himself or herself with relation to the state? And the second point I thought would be the issue of the two-tailed party and humor, which is interesting because I've heard many political commentators point out that this is also in some ways trivialization of the issue, or maybe there is a lack of any serious counter-offensive other than humor. But maybe that would be good to reflect on. Is that cynicism, or is that something positive about it?
To reflect on this, first of all, you're asking what's the duty of the writer in an authoritarian regime. I grew up on Romanian communism, and it was some sort of joy in decoding the language of the writers of literature. Political messages were hidden in nursery rhymes. Obviously, my parents were keeping these books under the floor, so they were all hidden because censorship was very, very strong. That was a clear dictatorship. We are talking about a very different system here in Hungary today, but it reminds me a lot of that Romanian communism, which was one of the toughest in the whole communist bloc. But I perfectly agree with Eszter that we absolutely don't have aggression and a physical persecution of artists. Actually, even the opposite sometimes. Token Jews and token Roma are used to exhibit. Now, actually, in the Castle district, there is an exhibition about Hungarians on one side, on the other side about Gypsies, as if they would be two separate people. So we can see this kind of subtle nationalism, again, this concept involved in this. But the most important problem is the dependency, what Eszter also mentioned, the financial dependency, that we inherited this system that art should be subsidized or supported by the government. And there are very few grassroots initiatives or independent forums where artists can express themselves freely. However, we still have a lot. We have art festivals, Bankito Festival, for instance, or you can go and visit while you're here, a very cool ruin pub, Aurora Club, which is absolutely independent from the government, and they can absolutely freely express whatever they want. They have theater, they have exhibitions, but interestingly, they have to become very political. They have to have a political message in this climate. They cannot just LARPul art be for art.
Three or 4 months ago, I won't laugh, but this is what happened. The government, somebody in the government, what Sanjay mentioned, that because a rationalist thinker and two writers had been murdered in the last 2 years by, allegedly by Hindu vigilantes, writers who had received national awards from the Academy of Letters across the country started returning the awards. And so the government sort of basically had to stem the rot, as it were, and the way they decided to do this was to ask Urdu writers, because Urdu is a minority language, but not simply a minority language, it's a Muslim language. Urdu writers have been asked to sign a pledge that nothing they have ever written before or anything they are going to write since is going to be critical of the government. Yeah? Okay. So what has also happened outside the artistic space, in the space of dissent, especially among students, if you are critical of the government, dissent is now automatically anti-national. There are four, when I left India, I've been away for a while, so by mid-April, there were 4 university campuses that had police stationed on them, yeah, to prevent student protests, to just make sure that nothing bad was happening. So what the government has actually done, what the current government has done, is politicize spaces that were formerly not political. It didn't matter. A writer wrote, pretty much writers in India wrote what they wanted to write. Some of them were political, some of them were apolitical, some of them cared, some of them didn't care. But with the kind of responses that the government is having to just, I don't know, people like walking down the street with a friend, writers have become politicized. In their opposition to the government, of course, they're political, but even in their support of the government, which is now a political act. So the politics that writers have to deal with now are very often not there. It's not coming from inside them, it's coming from the circumstance in which they find themselves. So they're responding in a political way to what should actually be an aesthetic and a literary environment.
I would say that this situation, in this sense, India and Hungary must be rather similar. Politics and politicians have the power to set the agenda for culture. So culture in itself is not interested, has never been interested enough, in Hungary at least. It attracted audiences during socialism as well as after socialism as a form of expressing loyalty, political loyalty, and political opinion. So both writers and audiences are highly politicized. This is, in one way, this is a dangerous development in my eyes, because, or tradition by now, because it means that there are many forms of art that do not receive any attention from the public or from media. I think we have a pretty free media, especially online outlets are very free and very critical of the government. So if they would pay attention to certain forms of art, or if they do pay attention to certain forms of art, or places such as Aurora or Atrium, or really a number of other places in the ruin pub scene, that means that those places come alive. But for artists who are not interested in politics, it's very difficult. And it also means that politics and politicians and political actors are able to force their tribal agendas on us. So you either have to be for or against. There are no nuances. There are no gray shades of gray. There are, sorry, I mean that was, you cannot use that expression anymore, I guess. Well, there are no positions in between. So we are deprived of individualism, of or like basic liberal cultural values by this tribalization of culture. It has its good sides because, you know, it makes people emotionally, it's easier to bond emotionally. These audiences are very dedicated, as we could see in the case of the director of the National Theatre, when he was not really removed, but not renewed his term 2 years ago. Then the audience erupted in spontaneous demonstrations during the last few occasions when they could visit the theater, the National Theatre. So it's obviously emotionally extremely mobilizing and satisfying experience. On the other hand, I think that it sets Hungarian culture, Hungarian science, Hungarian intellectual life back compared with Europe or America or that kind of slightly competitive but also a very quirky and individualistic culture that always forces you to be on your toes, to be on edge, to innovate. We do not innovate. It's forbidden to innovate. The only thing you can do under these circumstances is conform in this system of parallel institutions. Now, I do want to add, returning to the example of Aurora and other such places, that there is a new scene, a younger generation, a new scene, which is commercial. And because it's independent, because it is financially independent from the state, or even big funders such as the Soros network or Open Society Institute and so on, therefore they can afford to be both critical and free and non-tribal. And I think that the two-tailed dog party and its irreverence or the humor, what you see there, is part of this movement. So Gergely Kovács is one of the forerunners of this hard-necked independence of spirit. He has never been willing to conform to any other political group. Therefore, he might be seen as non-serious or lacking a real political agenda or whether supporting real people or whatever, but he certainly is my hero, and he certainly is the future in terms of a viable culture that is commercially viable as well as attractive to a large number of people, especially in Budapest. Of course, we must know that the country and Budapest are two complete, just as New York is not America, Budapest is not Hungary, so we always must be aware of this fact. So where I find hopeful signs is really this commercial sector or quasi-commercial that is also funded by independent donors or international donors, but is not dependent on the state or for the few such networks as the Soros network.
I know that we are running out of time, so I would love to open up the discussion for the floor and invite comments and questions from others, and maybe some of the issues that have been touched upon can come back in terms of reflection on each other's comments. So may I suggest that please keep your question brief if you can, and it would be nice if you can also say whom would you like, or the entire panel should respond to it.
Hi, coming from Britain, where as far as I'm aware, there's absolutely no state funding for writers, because I am one. Nobody's ever given me any money, and I live in penury. Do you think possibly one of the advantages of having no state funding and also having the internet is in the end there is no censorship on what is written? That people can, if you're not dependent on state funding, and you can, thanks to the internet, get absolutely anything out there, could that be seen as an advantage?
There's no state funding for writers in India either, and I cannot stress enough that the censorship of the arts and artists is still not coming from the state. So you're free to write whatever you want, but you don't know who you're going to offend, and if that person is offended enough to physically attack you or to make your life difficult, it's unlikely that the state will prevent that person from harassing you. So.
That is very different from Hungary, where it's the state that does not employ strong aggression or definitely nothing open, but marginalizes people, pushes them out from prestigious spaces like the Opera House or definitely the National Theatre. The director of the National Theatre was simply fired because he was called gay, but with a very obscene word. But you're absolutely right. Writers and literature in general flourishes under authoritarian regimes. And this was exactly one of the interesting things during the communism in Romania, that it was a pleasure to decode those poems or novels. And after the 90s, interestingly, this art and literature lost its function for a while. People didn't know, okay, so now what? Now what can we write? Now how can we read? How can we interpret? now literature when we don't have this interesting tool to decode things. But indeed, today, literature, I think, is the most flourishing part of industry and art. But they are self-funded, very badly funded. So again, if artists or writers want to survive, they need to confirm, as Eszter said, and then that's the issue. They cannot simply survive from what they sell, very, very rarely, and then again, exactly what Eszter said, they become quite commercial. And
that's certainly true in the UK as well.
I know writers that, for instance, write on fake names, simple, well, not cheap, but funny romance book or cookbooks, and at the same time write amazing postmodern literature on their own name, and they pay the publication from the romance book to the, yeah, I understand.
I think it's quite obvious that freedom is not good for high culture. It's just not good. I mean, high culture has always depended on some form of aristocracy, whether a political class or a wealthy class with children who are really bold and want to be someone. Therefore, they support art, or minority cultures, such as like emancipated Jewish patrons who want to be someone again, to find their own cultural role. Therefore, I think, yeah, freedom and democracy is bad. It's bad for the arts. And we have to accept that. And I tend to accept that. I think that it's okay to ghostwrite. And it's okay to, you know, I also know people who do these extremely stupid soap operas, writers. Well, okay, but they are completely free. They don't have, you know, they don't have to suck up, to any power, and they don't have to restrain their form of expression in any way. And I think it's worth it.
Okay, the gentleman. Yes, yourself on the grey coat. And
thank you very much indeed. Some months ago, I saw a film on India, and a very disturbing part of the film is the creation of militias among the Hindu, young, and the Muslim. Now, this is contrary to Gandhi's message, contrary to the democracy, culture, to the image of India as guardian of democracy in third world countries, and has a resonance, this kind of creation of militias. In Africa, militias suddenly turned into fully fledged armies, fighting each other. And from the film, young girls being trained how to shoot from Kalashnikovs. Now, I want you to reflect, is that going to lead to the fragmentation of India or war in the streets of Delhi and Bombay?
Maybe I'll leave Arshia to reply on that grim future for the country. I think I'm generating too much of angst in this room today.
I certainly helped you generate the angst about India. I certainly helped you generate the angst about India. I think I've seen the film that you're talking about, but I also want to say that it's only in the West that people think that India has absorbed Gandhian politics and Gandhian ideology. In India, Gandhi is killed every day 100 times, you know, by acts of omission and by acts of commission. Will there be another partition? I think not, because where would you draw the line? They drew the lines already in terms of, like, you know, minority and majority provinces. Will blood run in the streets? Yeah, it's running every day. I mean, somebody every day in India is being killed either for religion or for caste. So, yeah, it's not going to be, I hope there is not another great conflagration, you know, like in Gujarat in 2002, where there was a pogrom against Muslims. But just because that doesn't happen doesn't mean that we are not killing each other. So.
Peter had a question?
So I would like to ask about the tradition of freedom of speech and freedom of the press in Hungary and India. And so how do you see it, how strong this tradition is in the two countries, how strong we claim this tradition is, and what are the points of references, and how much free speech advocates and people who exercise their freedom of speech and freedom of the press argue with this. And I think it's very significant for several reasons. One, because if we can claim it as a national tradition, that's a great resource. And if we cannot claim it, or if we could but we do not do it, then we are in a really disadvantaged position when we try to make all the rational arguments, why is it important, while some populists, of course, say that this is what it means to be Indian or Hungarian.
From the Hungarian perspective, Peter, you are the only one that can answer this question because you wrote a book on this. I give it to you.
I really don't think we have a problem with the freedom of the press. So that's, I strongly believe that there is freedom of press in Hungary, not in public television. There is a huge government-funded campaign to indoctrinate people, and it extends to the schools. But other than that, in the age of the internet, you cannot actually completely, unless you shut down the internet, you cannot completely control the media and forms of cultural expression.
Sorry, this is the difference between India and Hungary, that here if you can use the online outlets easily and you're not going to be persecuted by the society, so you're not going to get death threats. Definitely, but regarding the tradition, I believe Hungary is in quite a good situation. That's why I wanted to show you those 19th century cartoons that we did, in Hungary did have much more freedom of expression, tradition of freedom of speech and expression, even during the communism, compared at least to my own country. But it's definitely a different situation in India.
Since independence, we've had a very free press and a very courageous press, and freedom of the press also, we realize now, freedom of the press also means that the press is free to choose to be ultra right-wing and, you know, vicious and hateful and inciting and all of that. What happens in India again is sort of very low key, like if there are news channels that are critical of the government, or if you're an interviewer that has a very aggressive interview with a cabinet member or something, within like 3 weeks or 4 weeks, the income tax department will come after you. There will be some inquiry about your funds. But that still happens in a democratic space. What many of us are beginning to fear now in India is that our television channels are being bought up by, like, you know, big corporations that support the current government and have a great stake in a sort of conservative India. So that, we haven't seen the results of it yet, but, you know, it's I imagine, I mean, they're buying the big television channels and the newspapers because they want to control the news, or they want to inflect the news, if not control it. So that'll happen soon enough. And then I think it'll be perhaps a more urgent question: how free is the press and the media in India?
If I may just add, Peter, continuing on what Arshia said, it has to do with ownership of the media. The newspaper for which I write, The Hindu, which is a rough equivalent of the Neb Sabad Shag, has had a series of changes in editorship simply because of the problem of the conflict between the owners and the editorial staff. What is really dangerous, according to many media analysts in India, is the fact that these lines have merged and the owners control the editorial content of newspapers. So that's the first issue. And the second issue is the space of the independent media has shrunk to the extent that the people who were extremely critical, independent, fearless journalists like P. Sainath in The Hindu, for instance, all moved out and created their own space called the Wire.in, a very independent initiative in online journalism with the stated aim that they want to stay clear of capital, market forces, and ownership, and create a journalism by the journalists for the country, for the citizens, and which is free from any influence of either ownership or politics of the kind which is what she's referring to. The second issue has been every night in India at 9 o'clock in the main news channel, there is something called as judgment trial by this gentleman who is the most sought after news anchor in the country. So he decides the agenda for that night. And so every day he creates a new set of issues which are probably ignored by many others. So in one sense, there is a dominance of the corporate media, especially at the level of public broadcasting through private television channels. In the print media, and as well as in the online media, there is a huge, I would say, realignment of forces, especially with regard to support for the new government. So it has been considered that many of the young voters who voted Narendra Modi to power come from the generation who are supposedly very much active on the internet, and thereby they occupy a lot of the social media space. So trolls, ganging up against writers and artists whom they do not like, this has become very interestingly a new trend too, where the conventional traditional media don't hold sway as much as with online forums.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentations. My question's for Arshia. I come from Pakistan, so I understand your frustration when you were talking about the issues. Two things. First of all, if you could please clarify, you said censorship is not coming from the state, and therefore they would not do anything to protect freedom of expression, but they still do have a positive obligation to protect freedom of expression. So just to clarify that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a fundamental right. They do, it's their job to protect my right to say what I want to say. They just do it very, very slowly, and, you know, if I sort of get killed along the way, well, wow, she died, you know, something like that, yeah.
Okay, and just secondly, on you gave an example of your colleague who was threatened that his hands would be cut off. I mean, that does create a chilling effect, and I don't want to write because I am scared, and I am scared for my family. Could you talk about the way forward or some of the things that are being done or need to be done by the civil society or by the artistic community?
You sound like my mother. My mother is always like, what are you saying? Why are you saying this? And so half the things that I write, I don't show her. And she was very agitated that I was going to come here and say bad things. And she said, you know, they watch you. I mean, really, really, on a very personal level, it's what I said. I don't know what is going to be offensive. How can I decide what not to say? So that's one thing. Am I personally scared? Actually, no. It could be because I'm very foolish. But there is a sense of solidarity among writers. There is a community. Perumal Murugan, who is the guy who said Perumal Murugan, the writer, is dead. He's been and stayed with us at the residency after that, at times when it was difficult for him to be in public. We offer a residency space to writers in danger from anywhere in the world. But what is very interesting is, you know, I mean, I think of what's happening in Bangladesh, right? And I think, my God, India is still, like, you know, a relatively safe place to be. So we get a lot of requests from international agencies and networks asking for safe spaces for Bangladeshi writers, and we always offer them, but not a single Bangladeshi writer comes to India. Yeah, they say, I don't feel safe. So there's that, you know, I mean, okay, I think for writers or artists who have families and who have children, their sense of endangerment is far greater than mine. And I know that a lot of writers also were very, very upset when Perumal Murugan decided, you know, he made this extremely it was a huge statement to hear in his own voice. Perumal Murugan, the writer, is dead. It's a beautiful, beautiful declaration of what, and a lot of people are like, what is this? Why is he not fighting? What about the rest of us? We do so much. And he's like, no, it's his choice. And his real concern was he has 2 college-going kids. And the town in which he lives is as big as his water bottle. You know, for those of us who live in metros, we are protected by numbers, we are protected by our elitism, we are protected by the fact that, you know, I have friends who speak English and who have access to media. Murugan doesn't have any of that. So those are always individual choices, how you choose to react to what is your own sense of danger. I don't think there is like an absolute sense of danger, and I think each one judges for oneself, and it also depends on the day. I mean, today I'm feeling really bolshy, you know, but I mean, next week I might be doing, oh God, what did I say, you know, so.
Hi, thank you. And just to one of the things that Eszter said about artists becoming very political or interested in politics, I think it's important to define the word politics, because if we understand it as you know, dealing with the issues of society, of your community, which the word originally means, I think it's a blessing. And for instance, theater, I'm a theater maker, has always been the most important public forum for social debate, even before the Berlin Wall came down. And I agree partially with what you said, that freedom, in some respects, doesn't help the arts, because, for instance, in the public theater scene in Hungary, when there was freedom, indeed, there was a tendency toward commercializing. That's becoming more commercial, and not dealing with politics, with the social issues. But please, let's not forget, on the other hand, that there was an incredibly, talking about Hungary, an incredibly strong independent theater scene, which was emancipated in those decades. And if you name the 3 most important ones, Bodo Viktor and Pinter Bela and Schilling Arpad, actually only one of those is still really at home here, because Bela Pinter, he actually managed to combine social criticism and relevancy and innovation and all of that with commercial success, which is just almost too good to be true. But Arpad Schilling and Viktor Bodo, in effect, they are living in exile in much better circumstances than those in the 70s, like Peter Halász, who had the choice of going to prison or really just completely leaving the country for good, what was then thought for good. And they are just making money abroad, and they are welcome to come and go. But in this respect, freedom is essential, for instance, for the independent theater scene, which I'm a member of. So I think it's there are sort of 2 sides to that coin. Sorry, that wasn't the question.
Thank you.
I completely agree with the comment. I'm sorry for being simplistic.
Just very briefly, Arshia, would you mind talking a little bit more about the cultural vigilantes, who they are exactly, where do they come from? Are they organized in any way? Are there, do people know who they are and what they do exactly, or is it more like a kind of invisible phenomenon to it, or not invisible, but difficult to explain phenomenon? And how are people sort of counteracting that?
Well, you know, it's not like they hide themselves. Everybody knows who they are. They're very often affiliated with some political party or the other, and you can imagine which political party they're affiliated with, they have different names. Sometimes they're called Ram Sena, sometimes they're called Bajrang Dal, sometimes they're called whatever. But there are all sort of Hindu constellations. Ram Sena means the army of Lord Rama. Bajrang Dal is the sort of party of Hanuman. And they're not shy. It's not like they hide their faces or anything like that. In fact, the recent horror with the students at Sanjay's alma mater, JNU, the guys who attacked the students and the left-wing students and beat them up, they're like, on television, like, hey, look at me, I did this, So, so we know who they are. They know who they are. The government knows who they are. The police know who they are. So they get arrested for one night, and then, some sort of flimsy charges are filed against them. Nothing serious, nothing like, attempt to murder, disturbing the peace, right? Nothing. There is there is no way to counteract them. There just isn't. You have the rule of law. The law is supposed to prevent this. The law is supposed to protect me, and it doesn't not protect me. It just does it very slowly, So it's not even Kafka. It's like something else. It's just extremely. But there's also, when Perumal Murugan, after he said that he's died as a writer, we were doing our literary weekend in Bangalore, and so we decided that as our solidarity with Murugan and as our protest against, people who don't allow us to say what we did a public reading of his novel that was problematic, right? It took us 5 hours, but people would come and read, somebody reads 10 pages, somebody reads 6 pages, whatever. But it was constant, we just, and we had said that this is what we were going to do because, the point of a protest is that you get noticed. You don't do a protest privately, So we had told the newspapers that, this is, that morning when I got to the venue, there were like TV cameras and OB vans and journalists like this. And I was like, what are you doing? And they said, what are you doing? And I was like, nothing. We're just reading the book. Huh, you're sitting in the corner and reading the book. I said, yeah. Oh, and they left. So there's there's also that you are expected, your protest has to have a decibel level. It was very good because it got covered very quietly by newspapers, and it was people, these guys had come, they were expecting sloganeering, and they were expecting, opposition groups that we'll be shouting, Perumal, and somebody else would be shouting, Badada. Sorry, man, So I think that's also very, very important that, and I think this is pushback, and I think this is a way of countering cultural vigilantes that, even though I said Gandhi's dead, we have to go back to Gandhian methods of protest. We have to be nonviolent. We cannot sort of add to the violence that is already everywhere. We have to protest in more and more kind of civil disobedience ways. But mainly, the most important thing is we have to be fearless. Even though the government is not going to protect us or whatever, if we allow fear into our hearts, then we're just all going to lie down and let, the bad people walk over us.
I'm afraid we have, okay, Sajal, you have the last question, and maybe with that we'll wind up the session.
Hi, I'd just like to ask a question to Arshia about the extent to which the diaspora has been an obstacle so much, but a help in terms of supporting artists. I know there's been letters and solidarity from organizations like English Pen, bringing together people like Salman Rushdie or Harry Kunzro and other writers who care about free speech in India, like Ian McEwan. Have those letters had any impact? And if not, why not, in your view?
There is, of course, the academic diaspora in the West has been in super solidarity with Indians on the ground. They've been very quick to protest, government oppression or inaction. Change.org has got a lot of Indian petitions on it. Of course, it makes a huge difference to individuals to know that, Noam Chomsky is writing in support of the students at Delhi University. Sheldon Pollock, a very, very great Sanskritist, possibly the greatest scholar of our time, wrote in support of the students, and then, immediately cultural vigilantes asked for his removal as the editor of, the Murthy Library. So everything you do has repercussions. I mean, Wendy, who's my teacher, Wendy Doniger, she actually, she hesitates to sign these huge public petitions, not because of her personal politics, but she feels that if her name is on there, she endangers the people around her, her colleagues in America, and she thinks about endangering me because I'm her most public student in India and the most known as her student. So of course it makes a very, very big difference to know that there is support from outside the country, but does it make a difference? No. I mean, this government doesn't care. It doesn't have a moral center. It will not respond to the idea that, there are better ways to be in the world. So, I mean, having said that, I sign every petition, right? Because I think it's important. It's important in many ways because there is great strength in numbers. You also, at this time, you just have to stand up and be counted. You have to. So you're actually creating, parallel institutions. You're creating a parallel resume, right? Look at the petitions I signed. You think I'm a troublemaker? Yes, because I've been doing this since 1987, when Salman Rushdie's book was banned in India. And also, when other people say to you, and it's very common in India now, oh, you're protesting about that. Where were you when something else happened? And you can say, you know what, I was there. I've protested every act that violates our right to speak freely, our right to write freely. So it is that. So it's very important to do, but it's useless. So, yeah.
Do you mean that, for instance, they don't have any impact on international pressure, so they don't?
No, it's been. It's a very old analysis of Gandhi as well, that, Gandhi was able to lead the kind of freedom movement that he did and gain independence for India because he was dealing with the British, right? Now that sort of seems to impute some higher morality to the British, that they were shamed or they felt guilty, and so they left. Hardly. They were done with India if, they'd exploited it for whatever they had to. There is a way in which governments can say, I don't care. I really don't care. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. Look at Solzhenitsyn. You can have while I think advocacy and all of that is critical because it spreads awareness among other people who may not know, or you can advocate such that people are convinced to support you, but I don't think it actually changes governments. I don't think it changes the mind of a government. In fact, it sort of makes them more recalcitrant. Oh, you're criticizing me? What? I'm going to stay exactly like this.
So, Jal, if I just may add to the point, I think it's a very interesting issue because on the one hand, Modi is right now in the US campaigning for the next round of diplomacy. There's a huge Indian diaspora, especially the non-resident Indians in the US and North America who are his traditional support base. But as Arshia is rightly pointing it out, we have had tremendous, overwhelming support for the Jawaharlal Nehru University RAV, starting from UD Butler, NYU, every single university you can name in the US and the world, Cambridge, Oxford came out in solidarity. It made a huge impact at one level. But the issue, going back to her question, who are these vigilantes? It's interesting to see that there is a certain realm of intellectual space that is being threatened at one level. But on the other hand, the Hindu fascist agenda works at a much more popular level. And the discourse is always twisted to say that these people are not really concerned with Indian issues. They're far removed from Indian realities. They're not connected to roti, makan issues. These are people who live in some ivory towers. So the writer, the artist is very removed, according to these popular discourses in media, from the real issues of India, which is Pakistan, which is a possible attack, which is the next cricket match, or who knows what. And the agenda is set by, as I said, people who sit in these television houses and unfortunately funded by the corporates. So that is what really matters to them. And if you scan the news which comes in the Times of India, which my professor used to call as the crimes of India, is literally what you might never imagine to be the most important news by any standards of journalism. So the agenda is set by others, money is given by the advertisers, if I may say so, and then who cares? The rest of the issue is not very important. On that possibly grim note, I thank all the panelists.